The 27th of November, 1941, brought Operation Crusader to one of its most powerful moments, contact between the Tobruk garrison and the relieving force. After days of confusion, armored loss, command anxiety, and savage fighting around Sidi Rezeg, Ed Duda, Bel Hamed, and the corridors south of the fortress, the idea of relief finally became physical. Men who had been attacking outward from Tobruk and men who had been pushing westward across the desert came close enough for the siege to feel breakable. Yet this was not a clean ending. Contact was a triumph, but it was also fragile, because in Crusader, nothing stayed won simply because it had been reached.
The importance of this moment came from the long months before it. Tobruk had been under siege since April, held by Allied and Commonwealth troops who endured bombardment, shortage, danger, and uncertainty while the desert war shifted around them. Earlier efforts to relieve the port had failed, and those failures gave Operation Crusader its urgency. The garrison had become more than an isolated force. It was a symbol of endurance and a practical problem for Rommel, because as long as Tobruk held, the Axis position in Cyrenaica remained incomplete. On the 27th of November, the men inside the perimeter were no longer only holding out, they were reaching toward a relieving army that had survived near collapse to reach them.
The contact was made possible by the westward advance of the 2nd New Zealand Division and the breakout effort from Tobruk's defenders. The New Zealanders had pushed through a battlefield already scarred by the destruction of armored formations and the shattering of 5th South African Brigade. Their advance toward Ad Duda and the ridges near Tobruk helped create the physical conditions for a link. From inside the fortress, the garrison had fought outward through Axis siege positions with infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers. The two movements were different in character, but they depended on each other. Relief was not something one side delivered and the other received. It was something both had to fight into existence.
For listeners following without a map, the simplest way to picture the moment is to imagine Tobruk as a defended pocket on the coast, with the relief force pushing in from the southeast across contested desert ground. Between them lay Axis positions, ridges, tracks, gun lines, and localities that had to be seized or bypassed. Ed Duda mattered because it helped form the hinge of the connection. Bel Hamed and the surrounding high ground mattered because observation and fire could decide whether a corridor remained open. The distance was not vast in ordinary terms, but in battle every mile could contain a minefield, a counterattack, a misunderstood order, or a gun position waiting in dust.
The contact itself had emotional force because it turned hope into sight and sound. The men who had been trapped inside Tobruk could know that friendly forces were no longer just a rumor beyond the perimeter. The troops coming from the east could know that the long purpose of Crusader had not been lost in the disasters of the previous days. Yet it is important not to turn this into a simple scene of rescue. The battlefield was still dangerous, the enemy was still present, and the corridor was not secure merely because friendly troops had met. In armored warfare, touching hands across a battlefield is not the same as controlling the space between them.
This distinction matters because Operation Crusader had repeatedly shown the gap between arrival and possession. Tanks could reach a place before infantry and guns could secure it. Infantry could seize a ridge and then face counterattack before the position was organized. Headquarters could mark a corridor as open, while the men inside it still faced artillery, armor, and confusion. Contact on the 27th of November was real, but it had to be turned into something durable. That required anti-tank defenses, artillery support, supply movement, communications, and fresh determination. A corridor is not a line on a map. It is a living route that must be defended hour by hour. For Rommel and the Axis forces, this contact was deeply dangerous. If the Tobruk garrison and the relieving army could maintain a connection, the siege would be ruptured, and Axis forces around the fortress could face pressure from two directions. German and Italian units therefore had every reason to strike back, cut the corridor, and restore isolation. Rommel's earlier dash toward the frontier had alarmed 8th Army headquarters, but the decisive ground remained near Tobruk. Contact at Ed Duda and the surrounding area showed that the British and Commonwealth offensive had not collapsed. It also meant that the Axis command now had to act quickly if it wanted to prevent temporary Allied success from becoming strategic change.
The fighting around the contact point demonstrated again that infantry was central to a tank campaign. The New Zealanders did not win by simply arriving. They had to hold exposed ground, organize anti-tank guns, coordinate artillery, maintain signals, and prepare for the counterblows that were almost certain to come. The Tobruk defenders faced the same problem from the other side. Tanks could support the effort, but they could not make the corridor permanent by themselves. The war in the desert was mobile, but the moment of contact depended on soldiers holding ridges, tracks, and defensive posts against enemy fire. It was a reminder that the age of tanks had not ended the need for disciplined infantry.
The psychological effect on 8th Army was also important. Only days earlier, panic had spread through headquarters as Rommel drove toward the frontier wire and British armor appeared dangerously weakened. The offensive had seemed close to failure. Contact with Tobruk did not erase the losses, but it proved that continuing had not been foolish. Auchinleck's insistence on pressing on now had visible meaning. The army had absorbed shock, replaced command uncertainty with persistence, and brought fresh infantry weight to the decisive place. In mobile war, morale can shift quickly, and this moment shifted it in favor of hope. But hope had to remain sober, because the enemy still had the power to reverse events.
For the men in the corridor, the practical problems were immediate. Supply had to move through ground that might still be under enemy observation or fire. Wounded men had to be evacuated. Units that had fought their way forward needed ammunition, food, water, and rest. But rest was difficult when the corridor's edges were still threatened. Commanders had to decide which ground to strengthen, where anti-tank guns should be placed, and how to keep contact between formations that had only just joined. The mechanics of relief were unromantic, but they mattered more than celebration. A siege is not truly broken until the connection can survive the enemy's attempt to close it.
This moment also helps explain why Crusader was not a clean victory story. The 27th of November delivered the emotional payoff of contact, but it did not end the campaign. The Axis army was not destroyed. Rommel was not finished. British and Commonwealth forces were still tired, damaged, and stretched. The corridor could be cut, and soon it would be threatened again. That fragility is what gives the moment its real historical meaning. It was not a parade, and it was not the final scene of a rescue drama. It was a hard-won opening in a battle that remained unstable, violent, and unresolved. In the larger story of armored warfare, contact with Tobruk shows that operational success often depends on connecting separate efforts under terrible conditions. The relief force, the garrison, the New Zealand infantry, the surviving British armor, artillery, engineers, supply troops, signals units, and commanders all had to contribute to the same result. No single tank type, no single commander, and no single charge made contact possible by itself. The event was the product of endurance after crisis, and that is one of Crusader's central lessons. Modern armored operations are not merely about speed across open ground. They are about making moving forces meet, support each other, and hold what their movement has gained.
The 27th of November deserves its place in this series because it captures both the promise and the uncertainty of mechanized war. After the failures of brevity and battle axe, after the early shocks of Bir el Gubi, after the bloodletting at Sidi Rezeg, after panic at headquarters,
Allied and Commonwealth troops finally reached the moment the campaign had been designed to produce. Tobruk was no longer completely alone. Yet the contact was fragile, and fragility was the truth of Operation Crusader. In the desert, victory was not a single moment of arrival. It was the harder work of keeping contact alive after the first exhausted men had found one another in the dust.